the webinars linked to the online course facilitating species conservation planning workshops. I'm delighted that we've got so many people on the course and such a illustrious group as well. As you will find out as we go through the course, this is the first time we run it, and there will be things that we will learn and we'll need to make changes. So you are our guinea pigs, our pilot group to go through, but I obviously hope you get a lot out of the program as well. In this first webinar, Caroline is going to give us an overview of this stage in our kind of 8-stage process of species conservation planning, in particular where there are multi-stakeholder workshops that you are using. She's going to be looking at preparing the plan. And as you go through the week, you will see some lectures that will go into some of the content that Caroline discusses in a bit more depth. There'll be some additional tools. There may be some things that will build on what Caroline is saying in this introductory webinar. And so it'll last for about half an hour, and then at the end we'll take questions, and if you have questions during it, just write them in the chat box. I'll keep my chat box open and either respond to you straight away or pass over to Caroline if necessary. So on that note, Caroline, I think I'll hand the baton over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone. It does seem slightly odd to be talking into my computer screen, and I know that you're out there, but I can't see you. So I'm going to walk through a number of slides. As Jamie said, I think that this should take about 20 to 25 minutes. I am going to pause periodically to see whether anyone has any questions, and at that point, Jamie, who is keeping track of the chat, the chat area, will be able to tell me if anyone has typed in any questions. I hope that the sound is going to be good enough. Sometimes we get some echoes, but I think we have a lot of people spread out over a large area, and so it is possible that there'll be some issues there, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about preparing to plan. I am very much looking at this from the perspective, as Jamie said, of preparing in the lead up to a large multi-stakeholder workshop. But I think that the things that are included in here can be translated to other kinds of planning fora and planning methods. I did, as I was practicing this earlier, think that perhaps it might have been better for you to be hearing this at the end of your course so that you will have a much better idea of what you're preparing for. But maybe that's the kind of feedback that you might be able to give us at the end of this, as it's the first time that we've done it. Okay, so preparing to plan, obviously we're just wanting to make sure that in the lead up to our planning workshop, everything that can be done to support a good result has been clearly identified and done to the best of our ability. So we want to think about anticipating problems and planning to avoid them. For our purposes, when we're thinking about preparation, we're thinking about how we can make sure that at the planning workshop itself, we have the right people in the room, we have the right process to lead them through, we have the right tools to support the work that they do there, and we have the best available information to hand. I'm going to talk through these 7 points during this talk. There are lots and lots of other things that we could wedge into this talk, but I think that these are the main things that most of us would do most of the time. So we're going to talk about agreeing on project scope and expected outputs. We're going to talk a little bit about establishing a planning team. We're going to talk a little about designing the planning process and deciding tools. We're going to talk about the need to engage the right stakeholders. We'll talk a little about assembling key information, about conducting pre-planning analyses where these are needed, and about addressing the need for an implementation framework. So starting to think upfront about how we're going to move forward with the implementation of the plan that comes from the planning workshop. Now, this slide it's a little messy, and I'm going to come back to it at the end. But essentially, the way that I quite like to think about planning in the lead up to a workshop is as a kind of countdown. So there are a number of milestones and key outputs that we want to get to ahead of the planning workshop. And those 7 things that I just talked about are captured within this. So you can see on the left-hand side of this screen a green column that begins at -26. So that's 6 months out from a planning workshop. And I always like to think of 6 months as a reasonable or minimum amount of time ahead of a workshop. Now, obviously, we can do small workshops in much less time. We have done workshops at relatively short notice, but 6 months is is a reasonable lead-in, and longer if possible, if you're really thinking about quite a large multi-stakeholder workshop of anywhere between 40 to 80 people. Not least of all because it's very difficult to get 40 to 80 people to find 3 days when they can all make it. Okay, so project scope and outputs. This is probably the most important thing that we'll do in preparation. So when someone approaches us to help them to plan the conservation of a species, it's so important that we understand upfront exactly what it is that that person or that group of people want to get from the planning process. And so on this slide here, there are just some examples of the kinds of questions that we might raise at that first meeting, in that first conversation, so that we can get some sense of whether the tools and processes that CPSG has and that we're talking to you about are really going to be a good fit for the project. So starting with very simple ones. Project scope, which species are we dealing with, which subspecies or population. That ought to be relatively simple, but sometimes there are some taxonomic issues and that can be stalling conservation work, so good to get that out of the way. And similarly, which regions or countries or areas. So those should be relatively simple boundaries that we can put around the project. And then we get to the more difficult areas. So the real problem definition. What conservation challenges are we trying to overcome? Are there particular threats that are attacking this species? Is it a focus of trade? Is there a disease outbreak that's threatening the last known population? Is it being squeezed out of its habitat? What are the conservation challenges that we're going to be trying to overcome? Because this will help us to think about who we need to have in the conversation. And are there specific decisions that need to be made? And I find it quite useful to ask that question up front, because sometimes there are very specific decisions that need to be made, and there's an expectation that those will surface at the workshop, but things won't necessarily surface unless we help them to surface. So it's good to know, are we thinking about translocating this species to another site, and we're trying to think about what kinds of site would be useful for that? Are we thinking about establishing an ex situ program for this species, and do we need to make a decision about that? Do we need to make a decision about continuing funding for a particular element of an existing project? Those kinds of things. It's good to get those things out on the table up front. Other useful things to ask are, why a planning workshop? Now, a stakeholder inclusive planning workshop is a lot of work. It's a lot of preparation. It's a lot of herding a large group of people to and from dinner, to and from hotels. So it's good to be really sure that that's going to be the thing that you need for planning. And when we ask this question, this is where we often start to surface things like conflict between or among stakeholders. So sometimes we'll we'll find that perhaps there are several projects to do with this species that are proceeding in parallel, and that they are not talking to each other, that there are some territorial issues, or we'll find that there is so much uncertainty in the data that people are unable to make decisions, and so we need to get people together to build consensus in the absence of clear evidence. Sometimes there'll be particular individuals that have very strong views about something that needs to happen, but they don't carry the support of other people whose support they really need to carry. So there are all sorts of human issues that tend to lead people to this kind of planning workshop, and it's very helpful to know about those things up front. And the other thing is why now? Why are people coming for help right now? Has something happened recently to the species? Is there a new crisis? Or is there an opportunity that we can make use of? So, for example, last year there was a symposium for sunbears held in Malaysia, and the organisers took the opportunity to add 2 days of planning on the end of that, because that meant that they could make use of all the brains that were in the room for the symposium in the lead up to the planning workshop. So sometimes there are opportunities or recent events that drive this, and it's quite good to know about those also. And the third thing here is outputs. So what is the expectation of the people who've come for help in terms of what they'll see out of the back of this planning work? Are they expecting a workshop report, which will be essentially a record of what happens during the planning workshop? Are they expecting a more formal conservation action plan or a government agency recovery plan from it? Are they expecting a technical document that has a lot of the analyses in it, if that's the kind of workshop that we're running? Or are they expecting something that's much lighter for decision makers or donors, that's actually quite brief and quite glossy and just captures the main points? So understanding what kind of product people would like from the planning process is quite important up front, because that can also help us to think about how we capture information and how we manage things in the lead up. Anybody have any questions about project scope and output so far? Okay.
Can I just make a quick point, Caroline? Yeah, I mean, is there? Yeah. I'm presuming, say, in terms of process, if you've got a question, then please, write it in the comments box just now. One thing I'll do just here is just make a link between what Caroline is talking about and also some additional points we make in the lectures that you may well not have seen yet, but you'll see during this week. And that this idea of being able to, be really clear about what the end point is of the process you're going through. I talk about a meetings model where you say, where are we now? Where do we want to be at the end? And then you've got this bit in the middle, which is where you think about process, the way in which you're going to use the time to get to the output that the audience want. But I mean, just building on Caroline's questions, I'm presuming that everyone has experienced meetings where there wasn't clear purpose laid out up front, and how kind of frustrating that can be when that occurs. So please have a think about that anyway. Maybe at the end of the talk we'll come back to that, and if you've got some examples you can share, then it would be good to hear about them then. Sorry, Caroline.
Okay, so I have an example here. What I really like to do, and I've learned the hard way that it's quite important to do it, is when I've had a conversation with a potential workshop organizer or driver about a particular conservation challenge that they would like to get some help around the planning aspects of, I do think it's very, very important to write down what you think has been agreed. It's so often the case that 3 or 4 or 5 people can meet for the first time and discuss something, and then all go away with completely different ideas about what has actually been agreed. So I do, for me at least, I think it's very important to write down what you think was agreed, what you think is the scope of the problem, what you think is the background to the problem, just very succinctly, and then use that to set some workshop goals against. So this is an example of a workshop that was done a couple of years ago now. It's for the Bellinger River snapping turtle, which is an Australian turtle, and I'm just going to read this out very quickly, just to give you a sense of the, you know, how much information I think it's reasonable to capture at this first stage. So the Bellinger River snapping turtle is a short-necked freshwater turtle endemic to a 60-kilometre stretch of the Bellinger River in New South Wales, Australia, and possibly a portion of the nearby Kallang River in coastal northeastern New South Wales. Okay, so we have roughly where it is and what it is that we're trying to address. So prior to 2015, the turtle was described as locally abundant, with a population estimated to range between 1,600 and 4,500 individuals. Potential threats to the population were considered to be vulnerabilities associated with limited distribution and specific habitat requirements, predation, alteration to water quality, and possible hybridisation and competition with the Murray River turtle. So that's a summary of the previous risks to this turtle. And then we get to understand why we need a workshop now. So in mid-February 2015, a significant mortality event was observed in the Bellinger River. Numerous dead and sick turtles were found. An examination of the tissues pointed to the presence of an infectious disease process. No pathogens were visible when viewed under light and electron microscopy. As a result of this event, it's estimated that approximately 300 juvenile turtles remain in the river. No adults have been found. There is some disagreement among experts on what to do and how, and the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage is seeking advice on appropriate conservation actions and research priorities to further develop the conservation project aimed to recover the turtle. So that essentially gives us the background to this issue. It tells us why we're having this workshop now. It tells us why we want a stakeholder inclusive workshop, because there's disagreement among experts, and it tells us essentially who is actually seeking advice and what they're planning to do with it. And so from this we could build some workshop goals, which were essentially to get these experts together and review the information available on the species and its reaction to the recent event, to review the information available on the disease itself, to review the information available on other existing or potential threats to the species, build a consensus interpretation of this information among the experts present, and to use this as the basis for recommending a plan of action for the turtle's recovery. So that gives us a very clear mandate and some very clear outputs to work with. So having got to that stage, then we need to establish a planning team. Now, I won't say too much about establishing a planning team. Once we have the size and shape of the problem, we should be able to start to get a sense, with help from the organisers, about who the key players are that we want to keep in the loop, and about who are the people who might actually be the doers, who might help us to get things moving, who might actually do the work of organising people, rallying people, putting together invitations to the workshop. But what's very important is that we have people on a core team who have a broad sense of the conservation challenge that we're trying to tackle, because they will be people who can help us to work through all of the issues that might come up at the planning workshop so that we can prepare adequately for them. Also in the core team, we want to have key implementers, because we want the people who will be implementing the plan to be thinking from the beginning of the planning process about the responsibility that they'll need to take at the end. And so a core team of 4 to 6 people is my preference. Sometimes the core team has to be larger, but it's also good to have a wider group of collaborators, people that it's important to keep in the loop, so that the project is not misinterpreted or miscommunicated to the wider groups of stakeholders that might be out there, but also because occasionally you might need additional expertise and advice from elsewhere. So designing the planning process and designing tools. So during this course, you'll be dealing in much more detail at the various planning steps. The steps that we'll be dealing with at in the workshop itself are defining success, understanding the system, agreeing on goals, evaluating alternative strategies for achieving those goals, specifying actions that will lead to the delivery of those strategies, and then preparing to implement. So those are the things that we're going to be walking people through during the workshop itself. But we want to do those things in the right way, with the right tools, at the right pace, given the people that we will have in the room and given the constraints of our venue, of our time, of our resources, and so on. And I think it's quite helpful with the organisers and if needed with a slightly larger group, right up close to when you start the planning process, to have a practice run of at least some of the major components of the workshop so that you can identify important issues and potential strategies for which you will need expertise, to flag potential areas of conflict for which you might need to do some extra preparation, to help set timeframes for specific workshop elements. If you know that things are going to be quite controversial, you need to allow more time for them. And that also helps you to think about what kinds of facilitation tools will be appropriate, and also to think about how much work can actually be done at the workshop and how much you'll need to do before and afterwards. So this is an example. Unfortunately, this is not an example of a practice run. This is actually an example of an issue generation exercise during a workshop. So it's quite good just to ask organisers just to think about all the challenges to conserving the species, or to the conservation challenge that they've set. So in this case, it was the viability of some bears in the wild. What are all of the obstacles, challenges, issues relating to the viability of some bears in the wild? And so we ask people to flag up anything that might increase deaths or reduce births of some bears in the wild, anything that might increase habitat loss or degrade habitat, and anything that might stop people from taking good, effective conservation action, and just see what fleshes out. And we can start to see, usually in these practice runs, that there'll be some themes. And with some bears, there's illegal trade is a big theme, lots of elements within that. Habitat protection is an issue. Communication among all of the different players in some bear conservation is something that comes up, and also that there are a lot of some bears in captive collections as a result of being rescued or confiscated and placed there, and maximising those contributions comes up as an issue. And once we can start to see these things crystallising, we can see that these are potential working group topics for a large multi-stakeholder workshop. And this helps us to think about who might need to be in the room. So if we're going to tackle illegal trade and habitat protection, and we're going to think about maximising ex situ contributions, we need to think about what experts, who we might be able to get in the room to help provide advice and information about those particular topics. And I think that Jamie is covering this in the course, but I quite like this scheme that's on the slide here for thinking about all the possible people that you might invite to this meeting, and thinking about which ones of those have enormous amounts of knowledge in these key areas, and which kinds of people or organisations have influence over these areas, and dealing in these areas, implementing actions that might arise from discussions of these areas. And you can see here that you could brainstorm a list of names or organisations and put them onto this scheme essentially. So those with lots of knowledge who also have influence over what happens on the ground would be very high priorities. Those who have very little influence and very little knowledge obviously would be lower priorities. But it's just a good simple way of helping a number of people to think around the sorts of people who can influence what conservation action is taken, those who might be impacted by conservation action, and those who have the kind of knowledge that will form the basis for people's decision making. And once you have a kind of draft list of potential stakeholders for the meeting, it can be quite helpful to go back to your draft working groups. And I think always bear in mind that on the day in the room, the issues may fall out quite differently, and you might need different groupings. But it's quite useful, I find at least, to go in with a sense of how things might fall out. And once you have a sense of how things might fall out, it's good to take your list of names and think about which of the groups they might fall into. And what you're looking for is a good balance of the way that the room would separate. So obviously you don't want a group of 3 working on illegal trade and a group of 43 working on habitat protection, because the 43 are not going to be able to contribute, and the 3 are not going to be sufficiently representative of all of the areas and avenues within illegal trade that need to be addressed. So it may be that when you've looked at how people might fall out, that you need to go back and look again at who's on the list, whether there's any tweaking that needs to be done. And when you have some sense really of who might be at the workshop, then you can start to look at how you'll build up the flow of tasks at the workshop so that you get through your planning steps. And I quite like to just map things onto this typical process. So a typical process would start with a welcome and introductions on day 1, some scene setting presentations so that everyone in the room gets to the same place with respect to what we know about, for example, sun bears and the threats to them and the conservation action in place at the moment. Then we might move to defining success as a group. What would success look like in this case? Then we start to think about the system, understanding the system that we're trying to change. That's likely to extend over into day 2. We'll agree some goals for changing that system. Then we'll start to evaluate alternative strategies for those goals. That might spill over into day 3. We'll specify actions and we'll think about our implementation framework, and then there'll be a closing ceremony or some wrapping up. Now that's just a very basic structure for a 3-day workshop, but there will be a whole bunch of constraints and issues to think about around that. So can we get through everything that we need to in 3 days? And if not, can we stick on a 4th day? Should we run a workshop, a pre-workshop workshop? Should we run a second workshop after the first workshop and split the work between the 2? Is that even possible in this case or not? If not, how do we make sure that we can squeeze everything into those 3 days? What kinds of facilities are available to us? How many people can we actually have at the workshop? Are the 60 people that we identified way too many? Will we have to cut that down because we can only really comfortably seat 35 people in the room? What languages do we need to use? If we're going to be working in more than one language, how will we manage that? Will we try to find budget for simultaneous translation, or will we be translating? Will we be having to repeat everything that is said in several languages? In which case, each task will take much longer. We will be able to accomplish less in the 3 days, and we need to be aware of that. Might we try and organise our working groups differently so that particular working groups can work just in one language? What are our options for doing that? What time can we start? Yes, sorry.
Sorry, there's a question that come in, and it's a good one to just pick up on, because it's it's a term we use quite a lot, but Vicky's just asked about what we mean by a system.
What we mean by a system? Ah,
yeah.
Okay, yes. Okay, that is a good question. And again, that's why I'm slightly wondering whether this is a webinar that should come at the end. At the end. So when we think about the system in the case of species conservation planning, what we're talking about is the species and all of the things that it interacts with. So we're thinking about the species, its immediate habitat, its ecology, the threats that are impacting on that ecology, and all of the influences on that species dynamics. If we were planning for something else, then the system would be different. But for a species, it's essentially the species and the way that it interacts with its environment and with the various conservation threats and challenges. Does that make sense?
Yes, well, I think so, and I'll see if Vicky writes anything down. But just adding to that, and in fact, that kind of what was sort of a rough causal flow diagram that you had up before, which you were saying, if you can go through some rapid assessment of what some of the factors might be that influence the species, that you'll be able to starting to build up there a picture of the system around the species. And so as well as, and in fact here, as well as there being the biological issues and ecological issues, there are also there's stuff that you could maybe lump in enabling environment or disenabling environment of how organizations are functioning that influences the system. So in the bottom of the diagram that you've got there, you've got what is it that could influence, could add to the inappropriateness, inadequacy of the conservation act. So you're talking, other things that may be to do with capacity, and these are all factors that are going to influence that species. It's like if you imagine a system as being like a cell, you've got your species inside the cell, and you've got stuff around it, the porous membrane, and factors are coming in and influencing that what's inside it, and what's inside it is influencing what's outside it. It's how it connects, as you say, with both the biological but also the human system around the species. And we're going to talk more about the sort of tools like this causal flow diagram in week 3, and we'll introduce a range of problem-solving tools that you could use to build up this sort of picture of the system. Vicky, does that explain does that answer your question? I'm going to presume that I presume so, unless I hear something different from Vicky. So thanks, Caroline. Do you want to carry on?
Okay. So essentially, thinking about all of the constraints that we have. So there are a couple down here, like what kinds of starting and closing ceremonies will be expected in a particular country, at a particular location. How much time do we need to set aside for that? So once we start to go through all of our constraints, we can start to really think about what kinds of tasks and tools will suit this particular set of circumstances. How much work do we really think we can get done, and what does this mean for getting our plan completed? Before I leave this, I just wanted to say that that there are different ways that we don't always carve the room up by threat, for example. That we might carve the room up by site if there are several sites that relate to a species, because there may be different people involved with conservation of the species or with management of the species at different sites. There may be different threats operating at different sites. Sometimes it can be useful to carve the room up that way, and sometimes it can be useful, and we're going to be doing this for a Tamarar workshop later this year, to begin by thinking about working groups around threat, and to move later into site-based working groups. So these are the kinds of things that we can think about once we have a sense of what the threats are, and we have a sense of the system or the characteristics of the species and its environment and its biological and political influences. We can start to really shape the process, and I'm sure that Jamie will cover that in quite a lot more detail as you progress through the course.
Caroline, just as you're talking
Yes.
about the biology, etc., of the system, and Dr. Agarwal has just asked a question about the amount of information on the biology and life cycle of the species in question that stakeholders should have. And
Yeah.
this is obviously, I mean, I suppose one point is that when you're thinking about, is this the right time to run a workshop? You know, the one question I imagine you'd ask is, well, there is a minimum amount of information we need to have, or is the workshop designed not to actually achieve any decisions, but to get that information together that you're actually using as an information generating exercise? I imagine the amount of information that is required on the biology and ecology of the species within that group of stakeholders is dependent on what you're trying to get out the other end and whether the two match up. Well, how would you respond to that question, or do I need to rephrase it again? So the question was, how much information do you need to have? Do stakeholders need to have about the species?
Okay. Yes, and that's a really good question, and the answer, really unhelpfully, is that it really depends. I think that we never want to feel that we have to wait until we have every imaginable bit of information that we would like to have before we start to act. And many of our workshops are run when there's really very little information, and the purpose, I think, as Jamie described, the purpose of the workshop can be about gathering together anyone who might have useful information and bringing them all together, and then sifting through what information each person has, discussing it, deciding how to interpret it, and then just starting to identify what the major gaps are and working out who's going to go away and try to fill those before meaningful planning work can take place. So I think that these workshops, the way in which they're structured, means that you can start, if necessary, from very little information. But what we're interested in and what we're always focused on is having the best available information. And almost always that is not complete. We never have complete information. And a very important part of the process is identifying which of the gaps are actually really important. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it does to me, and Gunnar, I think, and Dr. Agarwal are saying that's nicely explained. And I think it comes back to also, you talked about teams earlier on, about what teams you have. You've got this group that's coming together who may have called the meeting in the first place and feel there's a need for this workshop. But there may be additional teams that are created of people that might not necessarily be at the workshop, but are sources of information that help you gather the best available. And it may not be information about that particular species, particularly as Gunnar was saying, if there's you've got a really secretive one. And so the pangolins that we've been thinking about before, I imagine there's a certain amount of information that's going to be transferable from other species, or at least it's as good as we're going to get. And we're inferring how the species we're concerned with might be operating. So it may not just be information around that species, but if there's very little, then perhaps you're drawing in expertise in advance of a workshop to be able to say, well, what could we infer from other related species or species with similar ecological needs that may inform stakeholders when we come to the workshop?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, and we do often use analogue species, particularly in the population viability analyses work that we use to inform some of the decisions. We'll often turn to better known species that are similar to the species that we're interested in, and use the information from those to build our simulation models. So that's quite a good example. Okay, I'm going to move through now because I see that the time is ticking on. So. Engaging. So the next step really is to engage your stakeholders. Once you're comfortable that you know who your key stakeholders are, once you have a sense of the size and shape of the workshop, it's time to invite stakeholders and see who can actually be there. Obviously, if key people can't be there, there can be some juggling of dates, or you may have to rethink some of the work. and you may have to replace some of your original ideas. But engaging stakeholders, once you've engaged stakeholders, then it's all on and there's no turning back. Assembling key information. So now we're coming on to, although I won't talk about it in much more detail, but this is these are the kinds of pieces of information that we would generally gather for a species conservation planning workshop. So just as you'd expect, information about the biology, the distribution of the species, the threats to it or the known threats to it, past and present conservation activity, its ex situ status, if we're using population viability analysis models, input data for those models. So birth rates, death rates, anything we know about population growth rates, sex ratios, things that would feed into those models. And if there are disease issues, then there'll be disease risk analysis related data. So possible disease hazards and so on and so forth, depending on the process that we have designed. And what we need to think, when we're thinking about what kind of information to assemble, this can be very time consuming. So we do want to be quite targeted in the way that we do this. So we want to think carefully about what we want participants to have read before they arrive, because that will need to go out as briefing materials in advance of the meeting. What do we want participants to have at their fingertips during the workshop, because that will need to be deposited onto flash drives or onto in hard copy. And what information do we need to complete agreed pre-workshop analyses? So the PVA input data, for example, needs to be done relatively quickly so that we can complete the PVA analyses. The information that's going to be presented during the workshop can be gathered over time and a little bit closer to the workshop itself. So, so it's quite important to think about scheduling your information gathering.
Sorry, Caroline. Just before you jump forward, because you will be introducing a term there that some people might not understand until later on. We talked about, you mentioned PVA, so yes, population viability analysis, and there are some sort of software programs that can be used to help model what's going on with the species at the moment and the likely trajectory of the species over time, its extinction risk, etc., which is obviously it's a very helpful guide. It's never going to be perfect, but it's going to be a guide as to what might happen if we do nothing. And you can also use it to think about what happens if we adopt certain strategies. How might that affect the population? And the quality of that analysis is going to be largely dependent on the quality of the information you have on that species. But that's something that we're going to pick up in more depth in week 4 of the course, but you will see it referred to and more explanation provided of it earlier on. Okay, sorry, Caroline.
Yes. Thanks, Temi. Okay, so conducting pre-planning analyses, and I'm not going to talk about that here, but as Jamie says, that stuff will be picked up later on in the course. And there are some specific tools that CPSG uses, like the PVA tools, which are quite relevant to that step. And so the other thing to think about is the implementation planning. So starting to think about that very early on in the process. So we want these plans to be implemented, and we want to make sure that we do everything at the planning stage to give our plans the best possible chance of being successfully implemented. So we want to support people to develop implementation frameworks or governance structures or communication networks or whatever will be most appropriate to the project. We want to help people to identify what will be most appropriate to the project and to support them to get those things in place. So by the end of the workshop, it should be clear how the plan that's been generated will be moved into action. So that is, what level of ongoing coordination and communication will there be? When will progress be reviewed? Who will take responsibility for that? And how will these things be decided in the future? And different groups will require different approaches, but having this implementation framework in place is really important to sustaining momentum after the workshop. And so it's useful to begin discussions at the preparation stage. And in some cases, this is all preordained. There will be there will be an agency that will be responsible for this, and they will be the people who have come for some planning support. And so this isn't a big piece of work. But in other situations where we're really trying to connect a lot of agencies that don't that aren't related to each other operationally, where we're trying to connect a lot of different NGOs with some government agencies, with some academic institutions, and there's no existing framework for communication and collaboration, this piece can be really important. And so we like to think at the planning stage to get some ideas about what's likely to work, so that during the workshop we can have a team that are addressing that specifically. And this slide just shows some examples of the kind of some of the enormous variety of different kinds of implementation frameworks that may be appropriate in some instances. And so now I just wanted to come back really to this milestones and key outputs. So all of those things that I've just talked about essentially are captured in this schedule that I quite like to use and to show people at the outset of planning. So they're all little outputs. Each one of those steps is an output or a step in the planning process before a workshop. And having this, I find, helps me personally not become overly anxious about whether we're falling behind. It just keeps things on track. It lets us know where we're up to. I can be sure if I've ticked off everything on here that we will be able to run a workshop, and that nothing major will have been missed. But it's also helpful for other people that you're working with to be operating to the same kind of schedule. And there are a couple of pieces of further reading here. They're both the strategic planning for conservation handbooks that have been produced by the IUCN SSC in the past, and they both have a section on preparation where they'll cover these things and more. So I thought that these might be helpful reading and things that you can return to over and over again. Okay, so that's me done. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. And I think, Jamie, you're going to organise that.
Thanks very much for that, Caroline. What we'll start off with is there was one particular point that actually that was raised in the chat room, which is one that is interesting because we've been talking about it within CPSU within our meetings, and Dr. Agarwal has said, can the Red List assessment workshops and the conservation planning workshops be organised together with relevant stakeholders gathered for one occasion? I know this is something something that the SSC rightly promotes, because it's based on some very good, quite simple management thinking, that you have this sort of check, plan, do, or assess, plan, act. And assessment is around the red listing process. The planning side is the sort of thing we're talking about within this course. And obviously that then leads to action, which then leads to some form of reassessment. And so this link between assessing species and planning for species recovery is an interesting interchange, which in principle it sounds great to be able to do your assessment and your planning at the same time. I know that one issue is that the people that you get together to do the assessment are often not going to be the people who you're going to get together to do the planning, because one group is going to be around the experts, mainly pretty much exclusively, whereas the next phase has got to be involving implementers and decision makers. So the groups are going to differ. But Caroline, I wondered if you had anything you could add to that to answer that question.
Yes, well, I think you captured it pretty well there, Jamie. And we are, as Jamie says, we're very interested in working out how we can increase how we can have the red list complementing planning work and planning work complementing red listing work. But there is that issue of there being slightly different groups of people involved. However, it is definitely of enormous value to connect those two processes. And when we're putting together information for a species planning meeting, the first place that I look for the information on the biology and the distribution and the status and the threats is the Red List site and the Red List assessment, because that often has much of the key information. It might need some updating if the red listing was done a while ago, but it often has a lot of the key information. We are also wanting to work, we're testing out some processes for extending the red listing process, just as was suggested, into the planning realm, with a kind of an intermediate step, which where we can look at the red listing assessment that's been done for a large number of species. We can have some additional people in the room who understand a little bit about the situation on the ground and who the key implementers might be, who the key decision makers might be, and we want to be able to put the threats assessment and the conservation needs assessment of the red listing process through that through that additional expert filter, to see if we can agree for large groups of species what the next steps in conservation might be and what kind of planning support they might need. So we are really interested in making the most of the red listing process. One of the challenges though is that often when red listing is being done for a large number of species, that in itself can take several days, and then adding additional days on for planning can really limit who can attend. But that's a constant challenge, finding busy, productive people, finding 3 days or 4 days or 5 days in their calendar when they can meet to talk about these species is always a challenge.
Right, I'm gonna try something just now, and as I can see all of the attendees, and it'd be nice to hear some more voices apart from our own, is that if you would like to ask a question, could I ask you just to not to start talking, but if you can unmute your microphone, and then I will see who's unmuted, and then we'll try and order them so that people can ask questions. So the first I can see is Bahar. Do you want to ask your question or make a point?
Not exactly, because I lost some part, so I don't know. I mean, right now I don't have any questions, but I'm listening to all the people, and then I may have some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Bahar. So Ellie, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, can I check you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was just thinking, the issue generation that you did in your practice run, do you have any of the other key stakeholders or the core team involved in doing that, or do you need to do that yourself, so make sure you have all the information you would need to be able to do it? Because it seems like it's quite comprehensive.
Oh yes, no, I'm sorry. I should have been clearer about that. I would always do that with the core team, and I would take advice from the core team on which additional collaborators we might want to have in that conversation. So it's really, I never know enough about a particular species and its circumstances and its conservation needs to be able to do those things on my own. I'm only ever a conduit for other people's knowledge and experience of those things.
Right. So is that something that you would definitely do as a practice run, or is it something you could do early on in the sort of 3-day process, or is that too late?
Do you mean at the workshop itself?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we would always do it. Well, we would always do an issue generation piece at the workshop itself. And actually, what I showed you on the slide was actually from a workshop process. But because we are always so pushed for time during the workshop itself, we have to get all of those issues generated with perhaps 40 people contributing, so it goes quite quickly, and it can be quite chaotic. So it takes quite a lot of work to get something which draws a picture of the system. So we do that in a workshop, but then we have to very rapidly turn that around into a set of into the right number of the correct size working groups. And because we don't want to waste any time discussing what might or might not be the right kind of working group and how it's going to work out, and whether it could be this set of working groups or a different set of working groups, that can chew up a lot of time. So it's quite nice to be able to go into a workshop with maybe 1 or 2 options or 3 options of how the room might divide up around the kinds of issues that we expect to service. And there are always wildcards, there are always issues that come up that we're not expecting. But it's good to do that, just that first run through. And you don't have to gather people together to do it. It can be done. It can just be done on a Skype call. You don't have to do it in pictures and boxes and arrows. It can just be a list in a table, just something that encourages people to think about all the things that everyone else might spit out at the workshop.
Great, thank you.
Ellie, just to emphasise something, and I'm just going to take this. I think I'm going to take the screen back. I might not take the screen back. But what Caroline had up before was the kind of an 8-stage process for planning process, where the majority of those boxes were in green, because that's what happens during the workshop, and that understanding of the system that you did very rapidly with that initial smaller team, which is only going to be limited in its knowledge, but at least it's giving you a stab at how the sort of things you might need to be able to talk about and usefully critique within the workshop. That you've got stage 3 there on the screen, saying that understanding the system. That's where within those working groups you've sort of roughly worked out beforehand, you can really get into the meat of the system and apply the tools that we'll be talking about in week 3 to understand how these factors might be linked to drive a population down. So you are going to spend, it's going to be a really important and sweat-making time to understand the system, and you go into much more depth within the workshop.
Right.
Gono, you had a question. Would you like to ask yours? Gono, are you there? You've got your microphone unmuted, but maybe it was just like that beforehand. Any other? Sorry, microphone is not working. All right, so I'm just going to have a look and see what. Gono, do you want to just write your comment in the chat box, and I will then pick it up and with Caroline. Just one point I wanted to make, because it relates specifically to this week. The stakeholder analysis tool that Caroline ran through, that table that she had up, or a diagram she had up, which had influence going one side, so the extent of influence that people are going to, of a particular group, might have on the project, and then knowledge along the bottom. There are lots of variations on how you can split up or tools you can use to try and sift out the priority stakeholder groups involved. So that's one tool that Caroline talks about, and actually I had an interesting conversation with a colleague of ours, our boss, Bonnie Byers, because a point that she wanted to make, having gone through the material, is that for this course, is that we need to be careful to only think of stakeholders as being those people who are directly affected by that project or can directly influence it, i.e. often those people who are more closely physically associated with the species. Clearly they are of critical importance, as are governments and other decision-making bodies. But from a CPSG perspective, we would also see expertise, those people with deep knowledge of the species having a stake in that species. And most of the time, those people that are, have that knowledge, they do care about it, even if they may be living hundreds, thousands of miles away, and they have something they can contribute to planning for the species. And that's where that figure comes in, where we're not just thinking about influence on the project, but we're also thinking about how much knowledge does that group have, and therefore how helpful could it be to us making some good decisions. Gono, did you have a chance to write down, you said about your problem with your microphone. So we're actually just coming up to the end of the hour. Is there anybody else who wanted to make a point before we stop? Okay, I will assume that there isn't anybody else who would like to ask a question. Just so everybody knows, I've recorded this, and hopefully I will then be able to send a link. It is something that I will be doing for the first time now, but I will record it, and I will send you a link to this seminar, the webinar, so that you can then look at it in your leisure, or if you missed some parts of it, you can pick up on that. If you have any feedback on the webinar and how we could improve them next time or make it more valuable to you, then please let me know, because now's a good time for us to be making those tweaks. But I'm delighted that everybody managed to make it to the webinar. I hope you got a lot out of it. Caroline, huge thanks to you for going through that full process in a nice, succinct manner, and that provides a really nice frame for the content of the course that you will be covering. The participants will be covering during this week. The other point, last point I make, is the discussion threads. Tineke, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing your name properly. Apologies if not. But I've seen some comments from you, and that's great. And please do use that discussion thread, because that's where we can also pick up on any clarifying questions you might have, or additional points you want to make, whether it's to do with the webinar or whether it's to do with other content within the course, or something that you're dealing with at the moment that you think you'd like to share with people. Drop it into those discussion threads. I will see all of the points and respond to them, and where appropriate, we'll bring in other expertise as well to be able to help you with that. So use those discussion threads to interact with us throughout the 6-week course. So the next meeting Gono is asking is going to be, it's next week. I'm not going to tell you exactly when, because it's in the email, and I'm not very good at understanding time zones. But I think everybody has now been back in touch with me to tell me about their availability for next week. Caroline will be doing next week as well, where we'll be looking at the second stage in the process, which is the first point. What happens near the start of the workshop when you've got stakeholders together, which is around defining success. And I will be sending you a meeting request, as I did for this one, so that it goes into your calendar, and then you can connect with us next week. Caroline, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we go?
No, but thanks to everyone for showing up. Good effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, I hope that you all have a good week. Do let me know, say through the discussion thread in particular, if you've got any questions or you're not sure about anything, and we can try and pick up on any issues as we go through. Well, have a good week, everyone, and thank you very much, Caroline.
Thanks, Jeremy.
All right. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye, Jimmy. It was a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Good stuff. All right. Speak to you later.